All right, so here we are, um, back with Annie and Jordan, who, in the context of this channel, don't need any introduction. For a second conversation, a third for Jordan and I, but really a follow up to our last conversation regarding a proper education, and thinking about our first conversation between the three of us, and really immediately afterwards. We really focused on this issue of form, both in the positive sense of what should the form of a proper education look like, but also in the negative sense of why is public school and even most private schools, was a quote from you, Jordan, are insufficient, and not even just insufficient, but actively deforming children, and sort of a bunch of different details surrounding that and arguments for that. And so, but we finished without necessarily diving into content. Like if we have this form that we've all sort of agreed should look something like homeschool, embedded within a Eucharistic community, in your words, Annie, a church community, a local, like, embodied neighborhood community, or city, with people who do life together outside of just the educational setting and outside of just the word setting, but from this holistic perspective. What then is the actual content of that education from childhood up to, well, a lot of people in my generation have never reached adulthood, and so the goal would to be at some point reach adulthood. And so I think, Annie, your message to me when we were chatting a bit after that last conversation was, and I will actually read it because I think find that helpful. You said to me, if I can pull it up here. You said, I think it would probably be helpful for people to hear about what a soul formation education looks like, rooted in piety, liturgy, music, and gymnastic. First is formation of body, heart, and imagination. This is the ground of memory. Then out of that comes the development of the reason, and then expression last of all. We can look practically at how to structure home and community life to cultivate this pedagogical sequence, which obviously struck a chord for us, both Jordan and I, when I forwarded it to him, and that's why we find ourselves here today. So I appreciate both you guys being willing to continue the conversation. And Annie, I'll pass it to you to maybe talk about that just sequence at a high level, and then we can dive in wherever sort of comes alive, what makes sense, maybe in a step-by-step manner, but also potentially in a roundabout manner. So I'll pull up this image that you also sent me via email, and then pass it to you here. Perfect.
Yeah. Thanks, Gray. It's great to be back with you and Jordan talking about this. So, and I wanted to connect this to, Jordan, the conversation you recently had with Benjamin Boyce, which was excellent. And then I was listening to that, I felt resonances with this topic of education. In that conversation, you were looking through the lens of the catastrophe you lived through in North Carolina with Hurricane Helene, and the way that creates a kind of microcosm for the collapse of systems and then the emergence of a new system, or a new order, let's say, within that. And you had talked about how on day 1 or 2, everyone kind of, day 1 or 2 of a catastrophe, everyone tends to think, if I just hang in there, the old system is coming back. But then on day 3, this realization that the old system is dead. It's not coming back. We have a pivotal moment to decide whether we're going to fall apart or regroup and reroute in some kind of communal order. And that very much for me struck a chord in terms of how I understood what happened to education, for me 20, 30 years ago. And you also use the analogy of the cut flower, right? That once Western pedagogy was rooted in a sacred order, but as modernism progressed, particularly the late 19th century, it was cut from those sacred familial roots. That cut flower was put over in a vase of the machine, let's say, and it's been slowly withering and turning into goo. And we are definitely at a goo moment, right? And so what, it's totally collapsed. How are we going to reroute? What are the new institutions going to look like as they form? And you said in that, to create a new order, a new body, we have to have a new identity, a new narrative, and new institutions. And so, just kind of weaving these conversations together, Gray. And so that's what I'm proposing is this new, this new narrative that gives us a new identity, that we come from God and our telos is to return to God. And that's what it means to be human. And then therefore, that is the story of what it means to educate a human, to root them in the ground of divine being and aim them toward the life of the Trinity, right? So again, I like the analogy of the cut flower, and it reminded me of this picture of the tree, which we'll return to in just a second, where, there's a root that the child is in, and then an aim for which the life of the child is growing toward, right? So this anchor of education is really a microcosm of its telos, okay? And that the seed, the purpose must be present in the seed. And so the root of the human soul and a child's education is the family, which is a microcosmic sacred image of the life of the Trinity, of the heavenly family, right? So a proper identity for a human education, a proper narrative is that the child is rooted in the family, which is a microcosm of the telos towards which it moves, which is why education must be home and Eucharistically based, right? And so, one thing I'm excited to talk with Jordan about, because I'm not a leadership expert or an institution builder. And so my main frustrations in this process are with trying to take this story, this identity, and create functional institutions out of that, right? But I do know that the beginning place has to be the family, because the family is that microcosmic root, and the family is the basic unit in which culture is created, right? Culture is created. So that's kind of how I wanted to connect the conversations, and then I could move into explaining kind of an overview of piety, liturgy, gymnastics, and love as the fundamental elements of that root, if you want, or I can pause here and give Jordan or you a second to comment.
Let me see. Maybe the only useful thing I can say right now, well, I guess I'll say two things. One is yes. So it's nice when things are just sort of simply yes. and just to maybe highlight a little bit of the yesness, just to point out that that you might think from the point of view of a design, it would be good if in the design the root or the bottom, the foundation, the depth is the most foundational possible in principle, and that the end is the highest, brightest end if possible in principle, because then you don't have to worry about it. Like once you've actually accomplished that, you've said, okay, the micro and the macro are the ultimate in both directions. And by the way, we know that's not just conceptual, but we can actually identify what that means. It's full of content. It steers and guides in many, many different ways. Then you can actually just be done with that. That work is now complete. You've articulated properly the only possible foundation and aspiration that is adequate and is complete. And so, yes, we're done. So now we can actually move on to the next step of how do you deploy within that context? Like, how do we actually show how this approach, this methodology is organic? And but what I mean is it our bones are formed and flesh and sinew are put on those bones by the very nature of the method itself.
Yes, exactly. That's what's to be worked out. And another way to explain this is that what the world is, and then what a human is the marriage of heaven and earth, of spirit and body, a marriage of heaven and earth, which is why the family and the marriage bed of a faithful husband and wife is that microcosmic foundation for our existence, which is the marriage of heaven and earth, and the Eucharist table, which is the marriage of heaven and earth between Christ and his bride. So that's part of, again, just another way to see this is the proper route for what a human is, and out of which a human will grow toward their own participation in that divine life, right? Okay. And then I think because seeing the world sacramentally that way, we can look to nature for clues, right? So when we start to build up, put the flesh and the bones on this structure, look at the birth of a child. We'll just start with birth. The moment that child comes into a visible contact with us, the child is made to look to his mother, right? To see the face of his mother and receive the love and goodness of pure being. And that's the moment that the education begins. And from there, the infant child begins to perceive the form and the patterns of the world through his embodied nature, right? We as embodied incarnate creature, our education begins in the body as the body begins to, the incarnate creature through the body begins to explore the world, beginning with the mother's face, showing us that this is a relational process, a dialectical relational process that is grounded in love. It is the mother's love for her child, which she communicates through her face, that then begins the process of education, right? So, and then from there, so we have love and the goodness of being as that first root. And then the proper response to that is piety or gratitude to the source of being, right? So cultivating in the home a posture and practice of piety, that we receive life and love from God and we return it with gratitude and adoration. And that being the orientation out of which everything needs to grow, right? So in that tree that I sent you, Gray, you see that piety is the ground of a proper education, right? Because it is the proper orientation of the mind and the soul toward the source of being, one of love and worship and gratitude. And so we begin, I think that's the frame. Okay, so in terms of educating a child, it's really education, we talked about this last time, is about inculturation, creating a way of being in the world that we pass on to the child, right? So Lewis in The Abolition of Man talks about, it's about birds teaching younger birds to fly, to be bird-like, right? And so we're inviting our children, raising our children up into a way of being, which means our homes must model and manifest that way of being. They must be structured by piety, by practices of prayer and gratitude. And then our attention, our attitude being one of, the scripture says wisdom, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. So not only one of gratitude and wonder and respect, but a posture of, we tend to think of fear so easily in sinful, bent ways, as Lewis would say, bent ways. But properly, it just means, you have that phrase going around, it's kind of low grade, reality respecter. The beginning of wisdom is a reality respecter, to realize that reality is there and reality will push back. That the Lord ordered the world to work a certain way, and God will not be mocked, and a man will reap what he sows, and that that he has created the world on its foundations, and it will not be moved. There is a structure to the world which God has given it, which is good. And if we want to live well within that structure, we must have a proper piety, respect toward God's ordained structure of the world. And so cultivating those attitudes with our children. And at the very youngest level, that looks like boundaries. There are times to speak. There are times not to speak. There are things to touch. There are things not to touch. And just in the way that we develop the habits of the child, cultivating those postures of respect and honor and wonder and self-control is the way that we embody for the child, right, liturgies of piety in their life, if that makes sense. So I can pause. I guess two other thoughts I've had at this point is part of that piety is that reality respecting. Part of it is wonder, is realizing that the earth is the Lord's and all therein, and all that he makes possesses a logoi or a certain truth or goodness or beauty, which it is our joy to behold and to wonder. And so beginning education, with your child, that you take them out into the world and you say, look at this rose. Is it not beautiful? Look at this ladybug. Look at this spider. We have this orb spider that's woven a web right here. And each morning I'm coming out and wondering at the new web that the orb spider. And so these piety consists in that reality respecting, the proper fear of the Lord, which orients the child towards postures of self-control and basic discipline, as well as wonder, the ability to begin to perceive and behold and express joy in the glory of just being, of created things. So that's how I understand piety, as this root out of which then all education is going to begin. So let me pause there, see if y'all have thoughts or comments.
You'll know as a person who's been engaging in education, my type, which is I'm now racing ahead. I'm wondering if this might actually be an example of where an AI persona would it be appropriate? Like, could I basically just bottle Annie and provide this in sort of like at scale? But by the way, there are better ways to do it. But that's so yes. I mean, come on. I'm moving to the step of yes again, like yes, and yes. And I'm noticing also the beauty of there's a certain there's a symbolic structure here, which is that in some sense you represent the mother, I represent the father, Gray represents the son, young man, and my proper role at this moment is to do nothing but say, people out in the world, if you do not listen to what Annie is saying, I rebuke you and insult you. I call you out for your combination of knavery, vileness, and pulchritude, lack of pulchritude. And by the way, then begin to move towards how do we actually create that? How do we allow this, what you have to give, to be given more clearly and more fully, so that effectively everybody can do what it is that you're in the process of teaching. Yeah. I'm receiving it right now, and all I'm saying is like there's a continuity of yes. And each time you say something, I'm having epiphany after epiphany of the clarity, like the symmetry of the relationship between the family and the Eucharist. And the relationship between the immanent embodied relationality, and then the way that mirrors over into piety, and keeping those pieces continuing to reflect as they unfold. And I can almost see this embryonically at the actual how that process plays out. So I'll go back on mute so we could just continue. But my mind will be turning towards the step of how do we actually do this? How do we not just do it a little bit, but how do we actually empower everybody who chooses to participate in a thriving life and wants to raise their children in a good way to do this well?
Right. Yeah.
One thought. Sorry, just Andy, what you said about I love Lewis's point of like the bird representing the way of being of birdness for the chick, like that. It echoes. I was just listening to Ian McGilchrist and Chris Green on Karen Wong's channel, which was a wonderful conversation. And Ian, he's really good at beating this drum, maybe because it's like one of his central points is that it's attention is a moral act. And I just keep thinking that, like, when you're describing this, trying to instill this piety, and it's, when you think about it in the way you bifurcated it between like discipline and wonder, it's my head says, yes, of course, that makes sense. Easy, discipline over here, wonder over here. But in reality, like, I'm thinking about my context of a lot of young parents that I'm around, and like that's a difficult, I don't even want to call it a balance, because balance is probably the wrong word. It's difficult to cultivate those two things like simultaneously, because, and maybe because it's difficult sometimes for us as adults, just as humans, to embody both of those things. Like I think of parents I know, and maybe in my experience being raised, but definitely young parents I know, where they're really good at seeing opportunities to instill discipline. And maybe not even in a too harsh of a way, but it's like, hey, I have a friend who I think even said something like, you can always find an opportunity for discipline. Like, you can always find an opportunity if you're looking. And I'm like, I told my wife, I'm like, I'm not saying she's wrong, but gosh, that doesn't sound like a ton of fun, you know? And it's my way of acknowledging, like, where's the wonder, where's the lightness and the joy of this other sort of side of walking out in my front yard with my daughter, who is 7 months old, and she could be crying and losing it, and we walk out in the front yard, and our neighbor has this beautiful garden and trees, and she just instantly, even at 7 months old, is just like enraptured by the trees and the flowers and the bees, like all the thing. And I think about, man, I want to embody that awe for her, so that she can learn, like the little bird does from the big bird, like to see the world in this way. But there's a little bit of a tension there, or at least it feels like there is, between this instilling of discipline and orderliness, and, like you said, knowing when to speak and when not to, all these things, with this childlike wonder and awe that we should want them to see in us as adults, alongside a proper discipline. I come back to that McGilchrist, like, our very attention, like our children will learn by what we give attention to. And so piety is like, yes, it's the structures of liturgy, and it's when do you speak and when do you not, and put away your toys and all these things, and there's that side, but there's this, what I feel like is maybe more often lacking, is the attention to wonder, the attention, like that worshipful attention. I've just been recently reading, I was telling Jordan before you came on, Joseph Piper's Leisure, and like that is what he's talking about in that book so much, of like, if you can't recover this orientation towards like wonder and worship, then you will slowly be taken over by the sort of utilitarian mindset, which feels like it precludes the possibility of piety, even if we don't necessarily always see it that way. So
yeah, that's good. I wrote down here, at the heart of piety is the training of attention, which I forgot to use that word. So I'm really glad you bring that to the foreground, because it really is important and connected to wonder, and actually part of how we reintegrate those things, right? So I think you're, Gray, really giving a good voice to why this is so difficult to us. And the bad news is the way that both sin and modernism have deformed us, right? Making us feel that discipline and wonder are two separate things, or actually somehow in conflict. Our own souls have been so disordered by our own enculturation, right? That creating this new root and this new identity and this new narrative and putting flesh on it and living it out is difficult for us, right? But that's why we're here, right? To try and use the internet the best that we can to help people recover the sacred tradition. And as Milton says, education is all about repairing the ruins of our first parents, right? So I think one way, how I think about discipline and wonder, is as a dance. You look at a man and a woman dancing together, a tango or a waltz. You can distinguish the roles, but they are made to move together, right? And so you're right that discipline for what? Discipline for its own sake is not a proper end. It's discipline for training the attention back toward its proper aim, right? Which is the glory of the Lord shining and moving through all things. So in order to bring discipline and wonder together, we always have to keep in mind that discipline is the servant of worship, right? of the heart. And so another way we could think about this is through Heidi White's book. And I recently had a conversation with her, Duty and Desire. Duty or discipline structures our attention so that our desires get properly aimed. And if we understand it as a servant, then we'll be able to unite it together, discipline toward what. And I think when I think about what I notice for young parents that's really hard is the kind of Rousseauian, Jean-Jacques Rousseau romantic idea that inside the child is this beautiful, free, expressive self, and that we just need to open space, for the child's expressive self to emerge. And when you follow that logic, you get self-centered little tyrants, right? Because we're born into sin and brokenness and disorderedness, and our children desperately need us to order their attention and their control of their bodies into harmony with the world. That is not cruel. That is not mean. That is not oppressive. It is desperately needed. It's actually how you love your child. It's why scripture says, the man who hates his child, who does not discipline his child. That we love our children and we want them to grow into habits of being that bring them into harmony with the world. And that's for their own good. But you're right. The other side of it is when discipline itself becomes a kind of perfectionism, a kind of rigidity or a goal in and of itself. And that's why I like to think of disciplines according to like habits or routines or the habituation rather than some kind of like perfection of behavior that becomes kind of tyrannical. It's what is the ordinary normal habit of the self that I'm aiming toward, right? Not a perfectionism. And if you think about this in sports, you can understand how perfectionism, you want to, I don't know, in tennis is your sport, Gray, but I'm just thinking like baseball. No one's going to bat. Is it 1,000 or 100? Y'all, I'm showing my ignorance here. 1,000, right? If you try to aim for that goal, you're going to destroy yourself by aiming for that, which is impossible. What you try to aim for is a general habit of hitting well, right? And so I think that shifting from a perfectionism and a rigidity or a discipline for its own sake toward an understanding that it's habituation toward a higher goal helps bring those two dynamics into harmony, right? And I love, Jordan, how you brought up the male female. Actually, like I do think that there's something about the poetic nature of the feminine. Like the feminine is more related to the actualization of potential, toward embodiment, toward glory. And so I do think that the mother plays a more important and prominent role within these early years of pointing to beauty, embodiment, wonder, shepherding the child into those things. And then as the child grows up more and more, I perceive that the fatherly role, and again, kind of like you said, Jordan, like I'm just here to say yes and to, orient your attention to what Annie's saying. In the young years, that's a lot of what the father does, is just back up the mom as the mother through her. There's just a kind of magic to motherhood, a kind of magic that comes from the embodied feminine that invites children into the wonder and the beauty and the nurture of being. But then as they progress, they will need the stability, the challenge of the father more and more as they move into higher levels of education. So I thought, Jordan, it was worth pointing out that you kind of hinted at that the gender dynamic, which is part of, I think, the dance of especially early education. I'm right now working with these high schoolers, desperate to have some kind of other male teacher with me because these young teenage boys do not respond to me the way that they would respond to you, Jordan. And it's really challenging.
So let me throw a few things in there. One is, if you kind of like you take the two threads that are moving, the preparation of the newborn child to become the mother when her time comes is in many cases the through line, right? Because obviously if we can't pass this down in lineage generation after generation, then the whole thing has some instability to it. And that the participation in the inescapable relationship between the father and the mother that is expressed continuously by simply being in the actual context of the home is a primary content of the education. And so, as let's just say for the moment, the daughter, right, the infant daughter is witnessing how the mother shows up vis-a-vis her, is witnessing how the mother shows up vis-a-vis the father, how the father shows up vis-a-vis, and is beginning to model that inescapably. There's an the intrinsic through line at the center of this is that. And of course, if we can successfully hand off to our children the capacity to be parents, who can hand off to their children the capacity to be parents in whatever world they find themselves in, then we've done sort of the connection between heaven and earth is held in stability.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can remember one other piece that seemed like it was relevant at the moment. Apologies, I have to read my own handwriting now. I can't. What's the point of writing notes if I can't actually read my notes? Oh, that's an easy one. Oh well, I suppose just then carry on.
Okay. And I also want to emphasize the importance of doing this while children are very young, like from those first years, because this is when their hearts and their minds and their bodies are just putty. You know, we could talk about the neuroscience that goes behind, you know, the high plasticity of the child's brain and their high capacity to learn and develop all these things. But you have to begin as you mean to go on. And again, this is part of where that lie of Rousseauian self-expression goes. And what I see a lot of parents do is just crowd management. You know, as long as my kid is happy and entertained, I'm doing my job. And meanwhile, what it's training them to be self-centered, when really human happiness is upward oriented, not incurvy to say, turned in on the self, right? So by just thinking that my job is to keep the kid sort of happily contained within a containment sphere, one, it is encouraging that turn in on the self rather than aiming their attention upward and outward. So, and it's a hugely missed opportunity, because children in those first 5 years, it's the formative years for a reason. They're so moldable. And if you create these liturgical structures in your home that when we wake up, we go outside and we behold the rising sun and we say a little prayer together and we sing a little song together. And then we go in and we do, you know, you do this with your 2-year-old, your 3-year-old, they'll think it's fun. They'll think it's play. They'll think it's wonderful. And you do it again and again, right? The formation of the mind and the soul is through repetition. We are what we repeatedly do. That little child grows up for the first 4, 5, 6 years of their life in these liturgies of wonder and discipline. They'll think they're great. They'll come to love them. They'll want them, right? You know, one example just from my own family is my husband and I, just praise the Lord, by his grace, had clear mutual conviction that we were going to church every Sunday, come hell or high water. It was an anchor of the week. This is just a basic structure of the cosmos. And we were at church, you know, I sang. And so my husband was really cute. I would go a little early and I would lead in the worship team. And then my husband would come in with our little gaggle of girls. They're all like less than 2 years apart, little stair-step girls with dad having brushed their hair in, you know, amusing ways. And he would come in with the girls. And then we would, you know, do lunch afterwards. And this is what our family did year in, year out. My girls love it. We were gone for a month. They still, here as young 20-year-old adults, even though we go to a small church, went to church because they feel the way that it anchors and orients and brings peace to their week. And because it was a habit we set when they're so little, we never had to fight them about going to church as middle schoolers or teenagers. It was just embodied, enculturated into the way that they experience the world. So just an encouragement of those formative years. You have to begin as you mean to go on. You have to think about what seeds of orientation and enculturation do I want them to bear later. I have to plant those seeds now when they are able to like enjoy it and experience it with wonder.
Okay, I've got 4 things so I get to before I lose them. So the first was in relationship to the notion of discipline. I've found that the easiest way to grasp it properly is from a high point, not from a low point. So have you guys seen the video that was going around of like the old master musician who was teaching the young, quite skillful musician?
Yes, and I went and looked up a bunch more of his stuff because I found that to be so incredible.
See, that's discipline.
Yes.
And we can perceive it as it's easier to understand because the gap between the teaching and the beauty is so close.
Mm.
And because it's so fine grained that we can't actually even understand what the heck he's talking about, but we can tell that what he's doing is held in a level of care that is in some sense already transcendent.
Yes.
And so that's the right way of holding it, right? We're holding it in that way. And of course, the point is that you can use the word like a discipline in the sense of like a scientific discipline, for example, is the kind of thing where we're actually saying there's a way of forming a human. Right? Discipline is about helping a human be formed in a fashion that allows them to participate in the instrumentality of some way of being in relationship with the world. So in this case, the human, the violinist, was being formed such that he could express music even more beautifully. But as you discipline your tennis student, right, you're not yelling at them, well, unless you're in the very coarse-grained level, right? And we'll get there in a second. But my guess is that since you're at the college level, you're actually working with somebody who is already well along the way, and you're helping form them in a more and more subtle and more precise way so that they can express something even more beautifully.
Yeah.
That was why I loved that video so much, was because I related. I was like, the best coaching, like that is that. And people would watch that video and they're like, some people might be like, wow, he's kind of like, he's really into it. It's a little bit weird, almost like the movements of his body. And I'm like, that I experience that when I'm with a really good tennis player and you're just trying to get them to execute something and they do. And it's like, it just, I get it.
Right. Okay. So hold that. And then what we can do is we can reground that all the way back to the moment of birth and the mother's gaze on the child, and the child's gaze, reciprocal gaze on the mother, as being that. Because of course, at the moment of birth, the forming of the child is at the absolute instance of being a human in the world at all. Right? So you're in that point, right? You're in the point of, okay, I'm going to be discipling you in being a human in the world, which of course means ultimately being a human in vertical relationship and horizontal relationship. And if we were able to keep it in that pocket, that developmental pocket with continuity, then it would feel like that all the way up. So the point number 3. Point number 3 is, and we aren't going to be able to, because we're flotsam, right? We are flotsam of a tremendous degree of wreckage, individually and collectively. And so we will start out off on the wrong foot, and we will even more grotesquely get off on the wrong foot on a continuing basis. And so therefore, by the way, we will find ourselves, unfortunately, dealing with very coarse-grained discipline that doesn't feel anywhere near as close to forming somebody towards beauty. Right? So if you've got a child who's in the process of setting the cat on fire, you're so far that you actually are doing something which doesn't seem connected to beauty, because you're actually having to do a lot of remediation work. That's why it works that way. And of course, if you can do your job right, you take care of the boundaries, you bring the boundaries back in, and you've actually brought a child into an orderly enough place that gap starts getting closer, and then you can feel the connection between the discipline and the and the beauty. So then the last piece is what I'm noticing as I'm listening to Annie is something like 80% of the work that we have to do is actually teaching the parents to be able to do what she's talking about.
Yes.
And that will actually be a very hand-holding exercise, because you're learning it in medias res, right? You're already way over your own head. And we're so far away. So a program where, and I'm back at rebuking my churches for not using their space, a program where, like, the mission is teaching parents how to be proper educators and parents, Monday through 3 days a week at the church, with, by the way, an online content and attached mentors, call Annie, that kind of a thing, so that we can actually get back on track. This is probably a 2-generation exercise that we have to do a lot of heavy lifting work to bring things more towards back on track. And then if we do our job right, it is then in a place where our grandchildren are actually really good at this. They're like Annie's kids going to church. They've been held in that pocket for a whole generation. And so then we still have work to do, but now we're actually in a place where, for the most part, this thing is happening in a way that doesn't have a lot of boundary conditions. Sorry, it's not way off. And so we're not having to work with way off. So, all right, I will go back on mute now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really well said, Jordan. And I think, the idea of the carrot and the stick is cliche for a reason. That one way so you don't get discouraged when you're doing that large grain or low res, whatever word works, discipline work, the cat's on fire. And this is why I am a proponent of spanking young children. I don't really like spanking older children. I'm going to leave that up to dad's judgment. But I think it's actually gracious and kind to a 2-year-old when they go to poke the cat's eyes out or, touch the hot stove, a little quick sting of pain, something that they feel, a little sting of pain, so that they quickly register me doing that is bad. That's teaching them to be a reality respecter, right? In a proper way, not a way that's angry, not a way that's punitive in the sense of punishing the sin, but a way that is helping them register cognitively the significant importance of boundaries and reality is actually gracious and loving and kind. And trying to reason with your 2-year-old who has not developed the faculties of reason is actually can teach them to be manipulative, is, I think, often unkind and confusing, where a quick little experience of physical pain and appropriate measure is actually quick and kind and reorienting. Okay, so stick, and then redirect attention. Because again, the goal is not discipline itself. The goal is boundaries and structures that orient our affections and our attention and our desires in the proper way. And so you have, and this is part of that dance, right? The stick and then the redirection. So what can I not just discipline and then abandon the child in their pain, but discipline and then reorient? What can I offer for them as a direction for their desires, right? Because discipline alone, C.S. Lewis is so good about this. To lose desire is to lose hope and salvation. Because it is our desires and our longings and our achings that move us to seek God and pursue him. We want to never quench. This is why scripture says, do not be harsh with your children. You frustrate them. You quench their spirit. You want to direct their spirit toward the proper way. So, a reorientation of the desire. And I find that helps a lot of parents who are just afraid of discipline because they are afraid it's mean, to think, no, it's a quick and proper proportionate discipline is loving. And it then allows me to quickly move their attention toward an object of wonder or a proper object of desire, and get on with it, right? Because arguing with a child is actually unhelpful. So just what you made me think in terms of that. And maybe this is a good chance to then move to the next level. You got this ground of piety and liturgy, which help order, which help begin to discipline the child into the structures of the universe and order their desires in the proper aim. And then we have music and gymnastic, which I think of as the muses. The classical muses are poetry, epic, narrative, history, music, comedy, dance. The muses are these poetic forms of meaning that form the world, right? And so we want to begin to train our children in the beautiful forms of creation through beautiful language, through meaningful language, through many, many, many stories. And this is where Pajot will come in and talk about the importance of myth and fairy tale and the stories of saints and Bible stories, because all of these stories are manifestations of the fundamental narrative pattern of the cosmos. And the more we tell that narrative, that pattern with beauty that captures their attention and rouses their desire, right? We're shaping the heart of the child to enjoy and perceive and move into those patterns of reality. So that's the muses. And what Plato, so a lot of this structure comes from Plato. And what Plato said is that the musical arts, attune the soul to the patterns of the world in a way that rouses love and rouses desire. And for him, will provide this gentling, will gentle the aggressive soul by bringing it into harmony with these beautiful patterns. And he says that needs to be counterbalanced by gymnastics, by the athletic training of the body, which will train the child into courage and confidence. So for Plato, it was really important that the child take physical risks, encounter the risk of, we'll say in tennis, a ball flying quickly at you. There's a danger there, and they learn with courage and confidence to face that danger, to move into the world with a kind of courage and confidence. And that's what the gymnastic training of the body will do. And he says, if you only have gymnastics, you create kind of aggressive monsters. And if you only have music, you create kind of weak, ineffectual souls. And so you need both the gentling, desire building of beauty, but then also the development of a robustness and a strength and a courage and a confidence. And that those two coming together will create the harmonious soul able to move into the dangers and the realities of the world with goodness and virtue. So that's kind of like the big picture idea of why then the next step is that gymnastics and the music, what that practically looks like. Again, beginning at a very young age, reading to your child as soon as possible, having beautiful music in the home of all kinds of music, it can be all kinds of genre that have excellence in them. Beginning to train fine motor skills, gross motor skills, throwing ball. And so just most of the child's day in early education is filled with music and gymnastics, the training of, the beauty and strength. That's so much of, I think, what education should be up until 6-7 years old. I don't think there should be any kind of real formal kind of explicit academic study until 6 at the earliest, 7. That most of that early education is this beginning of the foundations of music and gymnastics.
I've tried to start early with Pajot's fairy tales, but my daughter tries to eat Snow White and Rapunzel every time I get one paragraph in, and so maybe you guys are close.
Maybe too early.
They're a bit long. They're a bit long for a baby.
You might have to. She loves the pictures though, which is there because they're so beautiful. You guys might have to tell Jonathan that he needs to release a board book version.
Yes, that would be great.
That'd be amazing. So let me layer in a few overtones, because again, this idea of really being attending to the liturgy is continues. It's going to be continuing to be part of what's happening. So, for example, to the degree to which you yourself genuinely love the music to which you are exposing your child, to the degree to which you're actually able to experience the music relationally, in other words, we're all singing together, or perhaps mom and dad are singing together, and the child is able to witness the beauty of that, the love expressed in singing together, all the better. Right. So that's important, right? Because we might find ourselves saying, no, I'm not as good at singing as, I don't know, fill in the blank.
Yes.
I'm not as good at playing as fill in the blank. And fair enough. Like sometimes you do want to actually have the Bach record playing because that's a thing. But ideally you actually like Bach, right? You're not just doing it because you've been told it's a good idea. Because that liturgy is inescapable. Right? If there's an anesthetic relationship that you have with content, that's the actual lesson your child is learning, which is really bad because you're teaching your child not to listen to their own deep, subtle instincts, but rather to participate in things because.
Yes.
And the flip, right? It's fall here and it's cold and rainy. So we actually pulled out our house church worship books and lit a fire and just sat around the fire singing worship music together because we wanted to. And that's really, really like has the richness, this complexity to it. And by the way, Annie, yes, I can also say vouch that through many different how do you say it, theories of pedagogy, up until around 6 or 7, this is exactly the right place to focus.
Yeah. Montessori, Charlotte Mason, all of the approaches to education, which are trying to respond to the problems of modernity, nice. Look toward the revival of musical, gymnastical education for young children. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying about it. That's exactly what needed to be said about it being relational. Because again, to think back to the bird, education is fundamentally mimetic. I'm trying to help the child become human, and I am their number one model for being human, right? Paul says, this is the structure of Christian discipleship. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. And that's part of, again, why a proper education needs to be consciously rooted in the family structure and the natural structures of relationship, where, as you said again too, Jordan, we model masculinity, femininity, we model piety. We can't give our children what we ourselves don't possess. And so that leads to 2 different principles. One, which you pick out, is don't be inauthentic. Don't use forms of music that you don't actually like. It's better. There's all kinds of forms of music. Pick stories and forms that you already have an affection for and build from there, so you can mimetically demonstrate authentically for your child wonder and enjoyment and good and beautiful things. But then the other is, here we are repairing the ruins, trying to offer our children an education we didn't quite have. And so we really need to take the posture of, I am learning with my child. Okay, I've heard that Bach is really excellent music that's good for the soul. I don't really know anything. I don't really like it. Find some, here's where we're going to harness the power of the internet to help us repair the ruins. Find something on the internet that will help you have an introduction to Bach and try it out with your child. So that, you kind of, there's one, I think it's Classical Conversations. They talk about, you just have to be the lead learner. You just need to be one step ahead of your kid. And then together you can repair the ruins of your own education and reform yourself in piety and liturgies of the home. You just have to be a step ahead of your kid and, sincere in your desire to pursue this. And, for me also, I like, you can learn, we're going to talk about sports. Okay. Maybe you aren't very athletic. You can learn with your child. You can go take tennis together or whatever kind of practice of discipline you want to do. So the importance of it being relational. Jordan also brings up the question of technology, right? So everyone, I think I said have music playing on, you play in your house. Well, that assumes actually a certain technological presence, right? Because so one way to think about this educational progression is an anamnesis of humanity's own development over time, right? So in a sense, you're returning your child to the beginning of the human story. One, they're just developing physically, but 2, you're walking them in a sense through the development of human knowledge, and a proper development goes to the beginning, right? So proper part of this education would actually be, I don't know, maybe most of the music we listen to is the music we sing ourselves. We make ourselves in order to develop actual musical education. There's probably a way in which we truncate our child's own musical development by just jumping to things playing on an MP3 player, right? So that's kind of what you revealed to me, an assumption that I had kind of allowed to sneak in there that really I should have thought about deeply.
Yeah, let's we can dig in on that particular piece because there's a bunch that comes out there. So one is we're getting close to the point where we activate the necessity and advantage of community, or in this particular case, church. Because of course, if you are in fact going to church every Sunday, in all likelihood, you will be encountering people who are better at music than you, who are, by the way, also love it, right? And there's an expression of all the elements that we're talking about. And so you have an opportunity, and it's fully participatory, at least if you're at my church. I don't know if that's true universally. I apologize for I don't know how that works more broadly. But there's your child actually gets to be able to be witness to that. You get that for free. You don't have to actually be a particularly skillful singer-songwriter if you participate in a community where there is a skillful singer-songwriter at least once a week.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece, so you've got two other pieces, and this is actually, by the way, there's been a lot of research on this. To the degree to which you create an image of perfection for your child that is too far for them to reach, many children will be demoralized.
Yeah.
And so if you're not a very good singer, your child can actually aspire to that. And your child can sing with you, which then begins a journey towards more, right? Deeper engagement, which is very nice, actually. Now, if you are a very good singer, your child can participate in that too, because your child's a child. They're very flexible. But if you're only sort of listening to something that was produced at very great expense and plucked from 1 in a billion, then you're creating an image. And by the way, this obviously is also in the physical sports, the gymnastics, the art, dancing, everything else. Like creating a model. Mimesis doesn't work if there's an asymmetry. Mimesis only works if there's a way to step towards it and feel like you're getting something like what's happening.
Yeah.
And then the next piece is I love that anamnesis of the human story, which is, for example, I mentioned for me to play is actually to play a record. Because a record is a physicality. You're actually seeing it. You can see what's happening. You can actually a record's actually analog, which is beautiful. You can actually see the ridges in the record and be curious about what the heck's going on. Music's being produced. And of course, one level closer is the physical instrument. And so, and you could play with like the little egg that shakes, or just the strings that make tones. And Steiner, by the way, who I have a lot of issues with, but he also has a lot of moments of genius. This idea of taking the moment of education in epiphany. So the moment that a child plucks a string and it makes a tone, and they connect the sound and the physicality together as a moment of epiphany that they can step into. That's a reach. And then of course you can add more strings, or you can add more tones and things like that in a stepwise fashion. So if you go too far too fast and too ethereal too fast, Alexa play Bach's sonata is neat in some sense. Like it's not that different from like listening to a rainstorm or looking at the Grand Canyon. The beauty is beauty, but there also is something about creating something which is at the imminence. You want to move from the imminent up to the transcendent and then back down and keep moving.
So good, Jordan. So good. We needed to go back and clarify that, because this education needs to be participatory at the appropriate level for the child, right? And you can have, Bach sort of as a background, but that's not education. And this is what technology will tempt us to do, is to say, oh, we're going to dance. Oh, we'll watch a dance. That's not educational. If you're right, more often than not, that's discouraging, because the gap is so far from a sort of perceived reality out there versus the participatory. And so education is what our own soul and bodies are capable of, how we are able to live and engage in the world, right? And that needs to start. I mean, this is why singing with your 2-year-old, little sing. This is why all of, Mother Goose, sort of, we remember way back in the history of our culture, nursery rhymes and little songs and ditties that we would sing with our kids. That's really important, that your little 2-year-old, who will not have any self-consciousness unless we put it on them, who will naturally just imitate you, whether they're tone deaf or not, and starting to sing songs and starting to imitate rhythms and starting to dance. I mean, at least women on Instagram love those little videos of little tiny 2-year-olds, like, trying to dance. They're not self-conscious. And so again, taking that formative softness of their soul and then using it to move them. Let's sing more. Let's dance more. Let's play with our hands and instruments more. Because really, the fact that so many of us are musically illiterate and incompetent is a crime. I think that participation in music, to play with a band, to sing with a choir, is one of the closest things we get to experience to heavenly divine ecstasy on earth. I think in marriage, we get to have sex that has a certain dynamic beauty and ecstasy to it, but that is a fire reserved within the marriage relationship. Musical dance is the closest thing we all get to do together to the ecstasy of communion in heaven, where our hearts and our minds and our bodies are caught up in meaningful song, in the wonder of beauty, in the harmony of movement together toward this kind of, y'all have felt that this is why rock concerts are the modern replacement for Eucharistic worship, right? Because of the power of music. And because of its power and because of its deep connection to who we are and how we were made and that joy that which we long for, the importance of, kind of as you were saying, Jordan, thinking long-term, giving our children as much as possible those formative disciplines and skills that will open up for them the possibility of playing a Bach cello concerto and perceiving that joy, that will open up for them the ability to sing harmony in a choir and feel the collective synergistic joy pulsing through their body as their own voice resonates with the echoes of their brothers and sisters in the beauty of a cathedral. We want to raise our children as much as possible toward those affordances of ecstasy and joy, which means not just having music on in the background, right? But taking the time as families and as communities to recover those folk traditions of singing together, of pulling out, the banjo or the guitar and playing together. So just trying to give a vision for not getting too busy and not being too self-conscious, but thinking, right, according to that trajectory, what seeds and habits I can sow here that will create those joyful divine affordances for them out there.
Yeah. So this is, you guys are, this has been a great experience for me because I'm thinking about examples from my life that you guys are shedding great light on. As I just think about my own development, like three come up very briefly. So, well, this is less development. This first one, this is more church and really putting a point to the musical aspect. I personally, so we go to a Protestant church where the worship is it's modern worship, right? So it's quite loud. And the moments that I love the most are when they decide to go acoustic or turn the instruments off. And even it's sometimes the best when they do that mid song or whatever. And there's this 3 minutes of all of a sudden you hear 1,000 just human voices. And I'm like, I know, because I'm a terrible singer, that most of you are also terrible singers. And yet when we join our voices together, it's incredible. It's beautiful. I mean, it's just it brings tears to my eyes. And unfortunately it's rare, in my context, but when it happens, I always walk out and I tell my wife, do they not realize how those moments are the moments? We need more of that, because it's just those, to hear all the human voices raised together, of which I know none of them, or not none of them, but very few of them are professional level singers. And yet the beauty that comes from just that natural sound is I'm immediately taken to just the vision and revelation of this is what it's going to look like, in the new creation.
Yeah.
And then the two, Jordan, your point about, and both of you, about there can be something discouraging about seeing the highest form of something. There's truth to that 100%. And you need every level. But I think in my life, in both, one in gymnastic and one in music. So for me as a tennis player, I first saw people playing tennis at my mom at a country club, right? So pretty low level country club tennis was the first witness I had of it. Along with then shortly thereafter on TV seeing the US Open, but that's a little bit different. But between the ages of 7 and 10, it was maybe once every 1.5 to 2 years. And I think the timing there is important. I wasn't constantly exposed to professional tennis, but once every year to 1.5 years, we almost made a pilgrimage to the Cincinnati Masters 1000 and then the US Open, where I got to see, I mean, I count myself literally, now that I understand more about human formation, I know this to be a crucial moment that actually led to me being as good of a tennis player as I was seeing Roger Federer win his first World Tour Finals in Houston in 2004. So I was not even 8 years old yet. And it was his first, he was 21, 22, and he had just really risen to the level of the greatest player of all time, essentially. And I got to see him in Houston live, and Roger Federer playing tennis is the gymnastic and the musical like coming together. I mean, just absolutely beautiful. And I remember having that vision of like, okay, I don't feel intimidated by how good he is, because I also have seen a lot of really bad tennis players. I feel incredibly just called to the beauty that he is representing with his level of mastery. And I'm not confronted with it every day, but that experience in Houston, I was able to take with me, across, and I go back home and I practice because I want to be like that. And I think that carried those every so often kind of trips to tournaments like that. And increasingly as I got older, they were calling me forward in a really important way. And the other one briefly is in the musical realm. Since a kid, I've loved Les Mis. It's just one of my favorite stories, probably my favorite story. My family, my mom loves it. Everybody in our family loves it. And being exposed to the musical form of Les Mis and some of the songs are I wouldn't call it complex music, right? Like it's very accessible even for a kid to enjoy some of the goofy songs in Les Mis alongside the more beautiful, like deeper ones. But being exposed to the story through the musical then led me to, in high school, when even at a public school, I had a good English teacher my freshman year who, we didn't read the entirety of Les Mis, but we read like key sections of it. And I remember being like excited to read that. Which most kids would be like, and especially I was not like raised in like I didn't have much of a formation, but I was like, wow, like I love the musical. I've enjoyed that as a kid, and now I'm being introduced to this much more complex, like super thick book. But I know I love this story, and I know I love the music, and so I'm excited to actually see the deeper patterns and the deeper story that exists in the novel form of it. And now as an adult, I'm like, I just love every single form of that story,
Right.
And so
that's where that poetic experience, right? The muses, the song, the dance, the poetic experience of beauty oriented your desire. And then at the proper time, you moved further up and further into, let's say, a more explicit or higher intellectual level of encounter with the logoi that was presented to you through the radiance of the glory of the poetic mode, right? That's your proper educational structure that this tree that we're kind of slowly moving towards. So that's a good illustration of that, right? How the poetic will lead you up further and further in to then the desire for the more rich understanding, intellectual understanding.
Yeah, and it's like I became a Christian. I already loved this story when I was not a Christian, and then becoming a Christian, it was I remember it like I hadn't seen the musical, read the book, listened to much of the music for a few years, and I remember returning to this story after becoming a Christian, and I was my now wife. We were dating at the time, and she was like working during the day. I had a break, and I was watching, I think the movie with Hugh Jackman, which is wonderful, at her house, and I was like in tears. And she was like, "Are you?" I'm like, I did not know that Jean Valjean's story is like one of the greatest exemplars of a journey of sanctification and theosis. Like I was just mind blown. I'm like, this is the most beautiful. And I already loved the story, but I had a love that came up, and then I became a Christian and was able to see this dimension of it that I was totally blind to before.
Right.
And now I could cry just thinking about it. Every time I hear, especially the songs at the end when Jean Valjean is dying, and I'm just like, I'm taken into heaven. Like I see the glory of the Lord is present in that for me in a way that I don't think would be there if I hadn't been formed to love it, though, from a young age.
Yeah. And I got to point out, that's the top of the pedagogical tree that we've been talking about, right? The poetic beauty, the poetic knowledge its glory captures your attention. moves you further into a desire to more intellectually understand the story. And then that moves you to perceive fully the glory of God in that thing, to discover God, the source of its beauty and wisdom. That is the end telos of this pedagogical structure. So I just want to point out, Gray, that your whole experience with Les Mis is exactly laying out, right, the educational pedagogy that I'm proposing for us.
Gray, I'm noticing that I'm hearkening back to our first conversation, and I'll kind of put it in the language of that first conversation, which is that to the degree to which you are interested in waging war against enemies and on behalf of that which is good, beautiful, and true, one of the sort of most basic strategic moves is to identify and seize the high ground. And what Annie is describing is, in fact, the high ground. So it may seem somewhat simple to say, well, no, actually form your children properly. Play music, recover the folk music traditions and play music with your people. Have a people to play music with and play music with them. But it's not. We live in such an unusual time that simply establishing the most basic things well and then connecting them all the way up, right? So this that frame of the most foundational foundation, and then the highest possible, highest critical. But establishing and living them is actually the proper strategy. It is the territory. If you can seize and hold that territory and then gather more people into that territory, then you are in fact actually winning the war.
Amen. Maybe we should notice, everyone, no curriculum. I've talked about zero curriculum so far, right? So much of this is just recovering the fundamentals of our humanity and the way we live. Okay, so from the musical and then gymnastic, after that way of being is developed and stable in your home, your family culture, then add in the beginning of formal studies, right? Again, I think a child it depends. All children are different. You kind of attend to the readiness of the child, their own interest. You're reading to them. Do they start to show interest in wanting to read? So I just think of these things, again, I like the tree as them organically growing out of one another, because all of these potentialities are latent within the child's soul. And the child will want, as Aristotle says, all men want to know. So you're reading with your child, you're doing life with your child, and they'll start to show a curiosity in reading for themselves, or maybe counting the apple slices for themselves, right? And that will move us into the two first, steps of formal education, which are the trivium, then the quadrivium. And I think the easy way to understand this is the language of word and number. So God created the world. He spoke it into being, which means that language is the fundamental fabric of the world, which we are seeking to know and understand in our formal education. Okay. So we're seeking to know the created world out here. Well, the created world is spoken into being. It's through language, and the two languages which God wove this created fabric together are word and number. Word and number. And God has revealed to himself to us as the word, as the logos, and logos meaning word, language, reason, meaning, purpose. It's just this really rich word, right? So the beginning of the formal study of the world is learning those two languages. The language of word, which is the trivium, that includes grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium, the study of number, which begins with arithmetic, the nature of number, moves to geometry, which is number extended in space, and then moves to astronomy, which is number in space and motion. And then fourth, a formal study of music, which is number in space and time according to ratio relationships. Okay, so that's how you can understand the progression of the quadrivium. And so, the child, you begin with a trivium, and you begin grammar naturally as you are just speaking to your child, cat, hand, dad, mom, you're beginning grammar just naturally in doing life. And then around maybe, I taught my daughters to read pretty early because they were interested in it and it was fun. And so if it's still kind of part of fun, sometimes you got to wait, particularly stereotypically boys who maybe are more oriented towards physical action, or their mind just take a little bit longer, and your boys are learning to read a little bit later. But it's perceiving, the readiness of the child, and then beginning to teach them to read through, which is so much easier than you think if you just follow classical, what's the word I'm looking for? Phonograms, phonics. Just teach them phonics, the way that letters work and sounds start to connect together. And then move them into grammar, which is the study of the form of how words start to build sentences and sentences start to build paragraphs. But also part of grammar is, if you think of grammar as the basic building blocks of a discipline, it'll include literature. So you're going to start to teach them the basic building blocks of literature: plot structure, symbol, allusion, just the structure of the way that story works, language works. That's your grammar. And you'll spend a lot of time in those elementary years teaching them grammar, which, I think a key principle in building up, fleshing out this education is the idea of easy plus one. Jordan, which you alluded to, is if I'm playing for them all the time, this high level, we're looking at high level, that can actually discourage the low level, because the highest doesn't stand without the lowest. And there's joy in all levels of learning, and this idea that I'm going to take what the kid already enjoys, that we're wondering and we're enjoying looking at the world, in this way, and then I'm just going to push them one step until that one step becomes easy. And then once that's easy, I easy plus one again. Easy plus one being the fundamental pedagogy, which sounds simple, right? But of course, in practice, we encounter all of our brokenness, all of our resistance. But I think the best way to deal with those difficulties, when things fall apart, when the kid's lighting the cat on fire, when they're throwing a temper tantrum, is to just have real clarity on our fundamental principles. I'm just going to return to easy plus one. I'm just going to return to the basics, and hold steady at the basics until the ripeness moves us forward at that point. So I can pause there. That's kind of an introduction to where I think formal studies begin, which is that beginning to study the structures of language formally, which would begin with, an hour a day of formal schooling, and then back to our family life, which is one of piety and liturgy and musical reading and music and gymnastics, but just beginning with about an hour of formal instruction a week. Another piece, Jordan, which you might want to speak to is, we're talking about the home as a root of education. That doesn't mean the home's isolated. That doesn't mean that all of this has to be done all alone, just the parents at home. Hopefully the family itself is fractally rooted in a Eucharistic community, by where we are doing these things together. We are gathering to make music together. We have the mom across the street or down at who's really good at drawing, and so she's inviting the kids over to do drawing or something like that. So I just kind of wanted to take this development one step further into the formal study, and that formal study is where then you might want to pick a curriculum, some kind of resource that helps you scope and sequence what a systematic exposure and growth into language study would look like. And again, there's a lot of good curriculums out there. People really worry about the right curriculum. I think it's just more to have a good one that you stick with. There's no perfect curriculum, right? So pick one that makes sense to you, kind of like Jordan, what you said of like, if you don't like classical music, it's not going to work. So pick a kind of resource that gives you an overview, a scope and sequence of the study of language that makes sense, intuitive to you, looks interesting to you. Work through that, stick with it. That's more important than fussing about, the perfectly perfect one. So let me pause there.
Okay, good. I've got a few things. So in the beginning was the Word. God spoke the world into being. And therefore, by the way, all aspects of the world are themselves language.
Yes.
A more profoundly anti-nominalist statement could not be made. Which, by the way, also implies then that we can teach and reinforce the experience of grammar in the context of everything.
Yes.
There is a grammar of cooking.
Yes.
There's a grammar. There's a really good grammar of Legos, right? The initiative, and you can co-create it with your child. Each piece can be named, and you can say, you can make metaconscious. You're naming the pieces, and then you can describe processes, a process of combination, a process of form. Can we make an L? Can we make a T? Can we make a brace? I'm using Legos as an example. And by the way, it builds all the way up to rhetoric. At a certain point, you will notice that you are making beautiful constructions out of Legos, and you notice that they stack on top of each other. You can notice how, if you can construct up from the grammar through the logic, right? The logic is, in this case, is how do you create structures that hold together? Do the wheels turn, right? Do the wheels turn? Do they operate?
Jordan, let me point out something right there, because if you're right, there's a grammar of everything. And if we have had this robust poetic musical formation in the beginning, where your child is, cooking with you, gardening with you, playing ball with you, just like doing life with you, a robust poetic knowledge. Then when you go to point out the structures, they'll see it because they've been playing with it and participating with it already, which is really why it's important to delay the formal aspect of our instruction, so that when you then show it to them, you're simply pointing out something they've been experiencing in rich participatory ways already.
Yeah, exactly. You can actually put in the word the anamnestic character of proper pedagogy. Which is often, in my case, almost always, is to say, remember when, and then when the child is in the place of being in that experience, the lesson lands. And then the lesson lands. You've actually created, you've grown them. They've grown forward. You've connected those pieces together. And the idea is that as you're moving into the curricular phase, what you're trying to do is move them into one meta step where they're actually able to take the thing that they've embodied fully, and they're actually able to perceive it from a point of view of looking at it and seeing how it works, which then of course means that orthogonal lessons, let's do gardening, let's do dance, let's do Legos, and I'm going to add another one in a moment, provide you the ability to then notice how generality works, which of course then gives content to logic, because then when you could say cat or the category of A, and you can give examples of things that fit in categories. So it's because it's very important, by the way, not to leap into pure rote. And so how do you create the materiality of phenomenon, of experience that allows logic to be embodied is very important.
Yes.
And the way you do that is you do grammar, multimodal grammar.
Yes.
And then you can actually show how these things are the same kind of thing and that categories are real. Sorry, back to skewering the nominalists. And here's another dimension, by the way, just so we can go both sides of the equation. You also have the fact that, at least in my experience, if you have a daughter, you have somebody who's very curious about families. They're very curious about aunts and uncles and cousins and sisters, and will oftentimes want to play different roles in families. That's also a grammar. Right? These are pieces of something that fit together, and they fit together in certain ways, and there's certain processes that are involved in it. And so you can kind of tap into the passion, the love, the orientation, and importantly, that matter. Really, these things all matter very much, to provide the material so that you can continue to move forward with it along the child's natural orientation.
Well said.
Let me just add one more piece, because you said it. You said it. The notion of pilgrimage to watch Federer, and I'd love to sort of formalize the disjunction that I believe Dreher brought in at Touchstone, which was pilgrim versus tourist. We wish to extinguish tourist in all of our engagements, and we wish to become pilgrims in all things. We wish to make every journey we make a journey that orients us more towards God. And that's what pilgrimage is. And so if you go out to eat, it should be a pilgrimage. Right? And whatever, and that, by the way, puts a lot of weight on it. You're probably not going to McDonald's on pilgrimage. You might be, and if you do, that's show me how. But that's just take that distinction, and if you can hit that distinction and make that kind of a rule of life, more and more good things will begin to happen.
That's
actually,
really helpful.
Yeah, let me throw one more out that I noticed I have noted several times, and this is again kind of from the masculine. And remember, we live in a remarkably depraved and horribly addictive world.
Yeah.
So this means, one, you're going to have to clean up your act because you're conveying to your child what life is. So if you're out playing or you're outside playing and your child is playing and you're on your phone, you're teaching your child that they aren't important, that play is not important, and whatever this box is important. That's all there is to it.
Yep.
No different than, say, if you're an alcoholic. Alcoholics have more viscerality of it. They don't want to convey alcoholism to their children. Guess what? So that's one. We're going to have to clean up our act. And we have to clean up our act all over the place. We also have to recognize that our culture, what do we call it? This free trade zone. The free trade zone that has consumed our culture has converted all mechanisms of expression, all media of pilgrimage into acts of tourism. And so every book that your child reads needs to be carefully separated. That which is designed to do nothing but separate you from your money and your child from the morality of their attention. And that which is in fact actually has integrity and therefore and you can tell, right? So we're going to have to clean up our act individually, and we're going to have to clean up your act by saying, hey, I will not expose my child to things that are designed to predate their souls. And that's not a trivial thing to do. This is a very, very hard thing to do. It's just as hard as not getting poison at the grocery store. And so that's important, right? That's the next stage of the war, is to say, hey, creating boundaries that actually make safety inside your kingdom, so that your children and by the way, your wife are able to live an ordinary human life, is a highly non-trivial act. But it's a critical and non-irreducible. You will lose that fight if you can't create that space.
Yeah. And that's why screens have no place in the foundational
in homes. Just say in homes. Just make it done. Screens have no place in homes.
Yeah. I mean, we watch movies together, and it hasn't been too damaging. But apart from there's one reason we have one screen in the shared place of our home, so that it is something we try to keep within a proper order, where if it's on, we are doing something together. We're watching the Aggies together with Dad, or we're watching a story together. And then often to try and integrate this, right? Kind of like you're saying, just doing everything with purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to watch this movie together, and then I made a cake, and while we eat cake, we're going to talk about the movie and use it as a chance to build relational dialectic, not just, watch it alone or all go to our rooms, but trying to incorporate these things into a proper home culture hierarchy, right? But what you're saying about the phone is so true. This is where we have to understand the medium is the message. The form is the message. The forms have meaning. When I'm on my phone, I am communicating loud and clear a certain meaning to my kid. This is where my affections are. This is where my attention is. And the thing you're doing is boring or not something I'm participating in. And that is that's a highly destructive, disintegrating message to the child. But to help us reframe it, well, it's not that I have to sacrifice and suffer for the sake of, my kid going through their poetic stage. I think a better way to think about it is I get to recover my soul with my child. What a gift my child is with their stage of visceral newness to the world. I get to bring my attention relationally, connect to them so that I can recover a little bit of the part of the childlike soul that I've lost. It's for my good that I put the phone away and participate in this place with this child, right? For the sake of them, for the sake of relationship, for the sake of my own healing and restoration as well. And framing it that way, is integrating to the family and our own relationship to God.
Great.
Well, just everything you guys are saying, like the image that strikes me is it feels, if you were to almost sum it up, it feels like a pedagogy that is doing its best to maintain an awareness of wholeness, right? Like as you age and the world, like everything in our society, like you're saying, Jordan, down to our level of thinking, we are such left-brained, like modern humans, wants to break apart and mine things for their utility. And everything is in separate silos. And like both what we've talked about for the last hour, so the beginning of the education that you described, Annie, is this like cultivation of the child's innate, like a child, I don't know, I'm thinking like in Barfield's terms, like is so much more porous to the world and so much more easily perceiving wholeness because their sense of perception just started. And it's such it's so delicate. And because if it's not formed in the right way early, you can, like it happened to me, I'm sure it happened to all of us, like at quite an early age, that wholeness is broken apart. And then to regain that is quite a difficult, is more difficult than the subtle art of maintaining it. Like to try to, and oftentimes probably will not happen, if it does happen, until some kind of adult awakening. Like I feel like I had in my early 20s, where it was like, whoa, I was deformed for such a long time to view things in this everything broken apart silos. Now it's like, I mean, I'm 29. It's been since I was 22 of like this real serious, being kicked in my axioms, like very, very low. Like I have to try to rebuild like my mode of perceiving it, which is a very deep and difficult thing to do. And by the grace of God, I feel like has happened slowly for me in fits and starts. But what you guys are describing is this, like, how can we engage in a higher level, like maintain this sense of wholeness, even as we try to build a capacity to understand the grammar of different things. With that, like, I'm focusing on the Legos and I'm understanding the grammar there, but I'm not losing sight of the fact that it is a grammar that's related to the grammar of cooking and the grammar of all these, my athletic. I think of in tennis, like it's been a huge gift to me on this journey of sort of having my perception transfigured, you might say, that I have a level of mastery in tennis, that I have a grammar, I have a language in my that comes from my mastery of tennis that really helps me understand all these things, because I know what it is to develop from a level of complete inexperience to a level of very high mastery. Yep. And I also work in trying to help people do that. And so I'm very familiar with the various rocks in the way, or hurdles. And so it's been helpful to understand that, because I'm able to sort of avoid some of those in my own journey now. But like when I think about my children through that lens, I'm like, wow. All I can say is it feels intimidating, but it also seems a lot less intimidating than trying to do what I'm doing in my 20s.
Nice. Yeah, I'm put to mind a thing that is said, and I think it's said rightly or kindly to mothers, which is, it took 9 months to put it on. It'll take at least a few months to take it off. I don't know if you're familiar with that turn of phrase. With regard to our culture and separation, it's taken at least 20 generations to put it on. It might take a while for us to get our way out of it. And I'm saying that not to be daunted, but rather to be liberated. Say, hey, our job is not to resolve this problem in the next 10 years. Our job is to metanoia, to turn around and start walking in the right direction.
Yeah.
And provide our children with more of the right direction, and our grandchildren with more. At some point down that journey, we'll be back on a path that is really, really sustainable and wholesome. And the wholeness is quite rich. Let me just throw in like a little tiny tidbit, because this was a substantial amount of work to get here, but it has actually worked out, and it's extremely simple. So, and the term here is ontological design, or the liturgy of your physical environment. When we were designing our house, one thing we absolutely did not do is produce an alcove for a TV to go in with the entire living room facing that alcove. we have the kitchen on one side, and we have the fireplace on the other side, and then there's living areas in between, and there is no place for a TV to go. But so that's one, right? So that creates a liturgy. It orients your day. I also do have an alcove for icons because Richard Rowland told me to, and I do what I'm told. But being a Protestant, I had to make sure there were only Jesus icons. And that's
Become Anglican, and then you can put up your Mary.
Oh, nice. Okay, Anglicans. Well, we're not going to go down there. I was talking to. So this is what I did with the screen, and I was a little bit cheeky about there's no rule for screens in the home because this is what we did. We have a screen, and we have watched movies. I got a pull down screen, which is pulled up almost all the time. And then I got a projector, and I attached the projector to a cart. It was zip ties, by the way, so it looks really like just the right level of engineering. And it takes setup. This is the point. It takes setup. It requires that we choose to do it. We move some furniture around. We create a space for it, and therefore this guarantees that we will not be doing it unintentionally. There'll be some level of conscious choice, which then implies conscious choice curating the content as well. So the form requires a bit of intentionality, which then supports intentionality around the content, and also supports the fact that if we're going to go through that work, it will actually be an event. We are now, there's going to be popcorn. Right? We'll be sitting together and watching, and it will be a collective event. And then, by the way, the collective event of separating it back again. And so that's a very simple thing. If you create the ontological design, is kind of like, well, it actually, I would say ritual is a kind of ontological design. And so it supports the choice making so that you don't have to fight against, you don't have to swim upstream against what is the right thing. You can make it so that the right thing is easier and easier to get to.
Exactly. You structure things so that the good is easier. It's structured to facilitate good, and that lesser goods have a lot of friction. You put friction in the way, right? So another way to do that would be not to have any streaming services. We have to buy. So we buy the movie we want to watch.
Nice.
And we tend to rewatch movies just the way that we rewatch books. Like if it's worth watching once, it's worth watching twice. And then as a way of life, the way that we participate in stories is meditative and contemplative. And we rewatch things and we meditate on them. So just ways of building in friction and intentionality.
I was lamenting the loss of the classic like late 90s, early 2000s DVD collection to a friend the other day, because I like we owned whatever 20 movies, just like you're describing, Annie. And my family, we have like Hamilton canon movies, one of which is Tombstone. I don't know if you guys like that movie, but it is one of my very, very favorite movies. And I've seen that movie easily 50 times because it was one of the not tremendous amount of DVDs that we owned. And so why not sit down and watch Tombstone for 3 hours? And it just, it got much more deeply into me. I understand that movie. And I also think I developed taste of what good acting looks like from Val Kilmer in that movie because I watched it so many times,
Yeah, that's right. So notice all these pieces. My oldest daughter announced that she's also dispensing with streaming services and requested on her birthday from us a Miyazaki collection DVD. Okay, so there's like 19 wins in that.
Yeah.
And you can see that there's the artifact, there's a ritual, there's a jewel case. It's called a jewel case. I mean, I know there's a marketing term, but there's an artifact that has a place in space. So you have to put it somewhere, and you have a physical relationship with going to it, and then you select and you pull it out. And you say, if you're buying it, that's a pretty decent amount of dough, which therefore means that it probably is pilgrimage, not tourism. Right. And so you can continue to have that reinforcement. And you also have, by the way, identity. People are going to come and see what it is that you own, and you're going to be pinned. If you have a collection of nonsense, then people will know that you're a person who's currently silly. If you actually have Tombstone, we'll go, hey, okay, great, we can talk. That's good stuff. I'll be your Huckleberry.
Yeah. You think about this principle of ontological design in terms of shaping your home for education. And again, when I think education, I'm thinking discipleship, I'm thinking raising us up into the fullness of our humanity. So, we would always have like a bean bag. When the girls were younger, we had bean bags and then 2 baskets of books so that it's very easy for us to plop into a bean bag, grab a book, and read together as a way to, this thing is going bad over here. Let's reset. Hey, come sit in my lap. Let's pick up a book. It's very easy. It's just right there to do it, right? We have a corner of our living room where the instruments are always out. The cello's out, the piano's out, the guitar's out, the djembe's out. It's just always there. So that when, I'm making dinner and like Elise, she'll go sit down on the piano and play me music while I make dinner.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of thinking of your ontological design of your home, structuring it so that the things we really value are easy, they're out, they're available, they're just there to walk over and do. And then the things that are, so one way to do this is people create boxes that they lock their phone in, structures of resistance for the things that will be temptations or less edifying. So thinking about ontological design is important in terms of helping root a way of learning in your home as well. And Gray, you said something about, the fact that you had mastery in tennis. So I want to try and point this out in a way that I hope is helpful. I love, Jordan, the way that you described multimodal grammar, right? Where you see, okay, that the fundamental grammatical structures of language, there's an analogical parallel to the structure, the fundamental grammar of Legos or for me, dressage, equestrian writing, that you start to see this fractal structure of nature, right? Where this pattern I see here has an analog to the similar pattern in another domain. And then I start to see the way that those patterns scale up. And this is why Charlotte Mason calls education the science of relations, of beginning to perceive the way that all things are interconnected and in a coherent cosmos that itself has a beautiful structure, right? Which is the image of the Logos creator, for whom and through whom all things were made, right? So a proper education, we're starting at the bottom. Again, just to kind of chart this out, we're starting at the bottom of our embodied patterns and the poetic, musical, physical structures in which we live. And then we begin, and this is just Plato's cave, although that gives it a negative connotation, but we're moving from the visible things which are outwardly manifest to us in their glory, and then perceiving the pattern that connects them, that moves us toward invisible. We move from the type or the manifestation to the idea behind the type. And we're able in that way to rise, as Plato says, more and more to the forms, which ultimately is the good, which is God. So again, that's another way of looking at this pedagogical structure. And why Charlotte Mason calls education the science of relations, which begins with our embodiment, moves step by step toward a greater perception of the patterns that form the whole till we see them united in the good that is Christ.
I noticed that I have run out of time.
Yes. This is a big topic to even fit into 2 hours.
Yeah, this is, I feel like we're probably going to have maybe even 2 more conversations. And I feel like it would be a good thing, which, by the way, would be the kickoff to a formal initiative to propagate this to every church with all the different infrastructure in place so that every parent who chooses to can begin the process of growing into one who can, in fact, educate their child properly in a community. So to empower parents in that fashion. So let this be the kickoff of that in a series of steps. We'll first do the easy part of having it in conversations, and then we'll do the harder part of actually building it as an institution, which we had talked about at the very, very beginning.
Yeah.
All about it.
Really good.
Yeah, this has been great. I really appreciate you guys. I'm going to have to rewatch this. There's a lot of food for thought. So we'll definitely continue it. I'll shoot you guys a message. We'll find a time. But really appreciate you guys taking the time. Jordan, enjoy the Western North Carolina leaf changing. I don't know if it's already happened, but if it's happening.
It's in the thick right now. Yeah, it's beautiful.
I'm actually going to be in your neck of the woods a little bit too late, though, early December. I might have to shoot you a message because I'm going to be going to Highlands in Western North Carolina.
Yeah.
It's I make pilgrimages there with my wife and friends every so often because it's just a magical place. So I'll be there soon, but enjoy that season. It's beautiful. And Annie, you and I actually have some decent weather here right now. So
I know it's finally cooled off below 70.
Yeah, I know. I'm like enjoying teaching tennis tremendously more than I was 6 weeks ago. So, all right, guys. Well, hey, have a great day. This has been really fun. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Gray.
All right.
Thanks, Jordan.
All right.
Cheers.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Cheers.